The last thing I expected to see in my kitchen that morning was my mother standing on her own 2 feet. 4 years. 4 years since the wheelchair became part of who she was, part of who we all were. And there she stood, hand gripping the door frame legs, trembling eyes locked on the driveway, where my husband's SUV had just disappeared. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't crying, she looked terrified. And the first words out of her mouth weren't a celebration. They were a warning. Monday mornings in our house had a rhythm I could set a watch to. Matthew came down the stairs first, suit pressed, rolling his carry-on behind him like he was late for a flight he'd already checked in for online. I was in the kitchen making coffee, still in my running clothes, half listening to the news and half thinking about the training schedule waiting for me at Fort Belvoir that afternoon. "Chicago again," he said, setting his bag by the door. 3 days, maybe 4 if the client wants Friday too. "Which client?" "Same one, risk assessment for their supply chain restructuring." He said it the way he said most things about his work, smoothly, with just enough detail to sound real and not enough to invite a follow-up question. I never asked for more. 8 years of marriage teaches you which doors your spouse doesn't want opened, and I'd learned to respect his. He crossed the kitchen and kissed me quick and familiar, then crouched down in front of my mother's wheelchair and took her hand the way he always did, like she was something fragile he'd been entrusted to protect. "Take care of each other," he said. Eleanor gave him a small nod. Nothing in her face gave anything away. I remember thinking, even in that ordinary moment, how good Matthew had gotten at this, the tenderness, the ritual of it. 4 years of watching him become the son she never had. At the door he paused and looked back at me. "You sure you don't need to head to Belvoir before noon?" "I told you 3 o'clock. "Right, 3. He said it again under his breath like he was double-checking something in a ledger only he could see. I didn't think anything of it. Why would I, Matthew, asked questions like that all the time, logistics, timing, who was where and when? It was how his brain worked, risk assessment even at home. The SUV backed out of the driveway. I watched it go from the kitchen window, then turned back to my coffee, already half lost in the day ahead of me. The paperwork on my desk, the soldiers I needed to check in on the grocery list stuck to the fridge with a magnet shaped like the Washington Monument. That's when I heard it. Not the low mechanical whine of my mother's wheelchair rolling across the hardwood. Footsteps, uneven, halting, but unmistakably footsteps. I turned around so fast I knocked the spoon off the counter. My mother was standing. She had one hand braced against the doorframe between the kitchen and the hallway, her whole body trembling with the effort of holding herself upright, but she was standing, not falling, not stumbling into a fall. Standing the way she used to stand at the stove on Sunday mornings, the way she used to stand at my wedding. Mom," my voice came out smaller than I meant it to. She took a step. An actual step, her bare foot pressing flat against the floor, her weight shifting forward with a kind of controlled, deliberate effort I hadn't seen from her in years. "Mom, you can walk." I expected tears. I expected her to reach for me, to laugh, to say something about miracles or physical therapy or the doctors being wrong. Instead, Eleanor's eyes went past me toward the window, toward the empty driveway, making absolutely sure the SUV was gone. Then she whispered so quietly I almost missed it. "We need to go, now." I didn't move. I couldn't. My mind was still trying to process the mechanics of what I was seeing, the balance, the strength in legs that had been still for 4 years when she reached down into the cushion of her wheelchair and pulled out a small white envelope that had clearly been hidden there for some time. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice cracking somewhere between joy and confusion. "Mom, this is huge. Why would you hide this from me?" "Because I needed Matthew to believe I still couldn't." She said it flatly, like a fact she'd rehearsed, like something she'd known for a long time and had been waiting for the right moment to say out loud. I opened my mouth to ask what she meant, but she was already pressing the envelope into my hands. Inside was a single key, small and brass, and a folded slip of paper with an address written in her careful handwriting, a self-storage facility in Alexandria, maybe 20 minutes from where we stood. "Mom, what is this?" She didn't answer right away. She reached for my hand instead, and her grip was stronger than I expected. Stronger than a woman who'd supposedly been confined to a chair for 4 years had any right to be. "Your husband thinks I'm helpless, Ava," she said. That's why he stopped being careful around me. Every instinct I had, the instinct that had kept me steady through deployments, through firefights, in briefing rooms, through 12 years of learning to read a room before it turned dangerous, told me to reach for my phone and call Matthew right then. To ask him what my mother was talking about, to hear him laugh it off, to have this all make sense in 30 seconds, the way most misunderstandings did. Eleanor must have seen it on my face because she tightened her grip on my hand. "If you call him now," she said, "he'll know we know." "Know what?" I asked. And even as the words left my mouth, some part of me, some part that had spent a decade learning to trust evidence over instinct, already understood that the answer was going to change everything. My mother looked at me the way she used to look at me before I shipped out, like she was memorizing my face in case it was the last time. "That your husband has been preparing for you to lose everything." The drive to Alexandria took 18 minutes, and I don't remember any of it except the sound of my mother's voice steady and quiet in the passenger seat, filling in 4 years I thought I already knew. I'd always understood the wheelchair as a single event with a single cause. My mother fell down the stairs in our house. My house, the one Matthew and I bought 2 years into our marriage, and broke her pelvis in a fall bad enough to require 3 surgeries, and a recovery no doctor would commit to in writing. They never told us she'd never walk again. They told us it was uncertain, somewhere between the uncertainty and the exhaustion of watching her relearn how to sit up in bed. Uncertain quietly became permanent in all our minds, mine most of all. And Matthew had been extraordinary. I want to be honest about that because it matters. During the months I was training at Fort Bragg, unreachable for stretches at a time, he drove my mother to every appointment. He learned the names of her physical therapists. He fought with our insurance company on hold for 90 minutes at a stretch. He built a ramp over our front steps with his own hands on a weekend I was in the field. And when I came home and saw it, I cried in the driveway before I even got my bag out of the car. I trusted him with her life. That's not an exaggeration. I trusted my husband with my mother's life, and for 4 years I believed that trust had been honored. About 6 months ago, Eleanor said, watching the storage facility signs pass on the highway, he started asking me things. "What kind of things?" "Whether you ever talked about leaving the army, whether you seemed stressed, whether you were forgetting things when you were tired." She said each question like she was reading them off a list, and in a way I think she was a list she'd built in her head over months of sitting in rooms where people forgot she was listening. "I thought he was worried about you," she continued. "That's what I told myself at first, a husband checking in on his wife. But then I heard him on the phone in the garage. He didn't know I could hear him through the door. I gripped the steering wheel and didn't say anything because I understood somewhere in the pit of my stomach that I needed to let her finish. He said, 'As long as she keeps signing what I put in front of her, we're fine.'" The words landed somewhere behind my ribs and stayed there. "I started paying attention after that," she said. "Bank letters that came to the house and disappeared before you saw them. Files he'd leave open on his laptop when he thought I was asleep in the next room. And then..." She paused, and for the first time in the conversation, her voice wavered slightly. "Then my legs got stronger. The therapist said I was progressing faster than anyone expected. And I made a decision." "You decided not to tell him." "I decided not to tell anyone, not you, not him. I kept using the chair whenever he was in the house. I did my walking with the therapist during the hours he was at work, and I made sure I was back in that chair before he ever came home." She looked at me then, and there was something almost apologetic in her eyes, though I understood even in that moment that she had nothing to apologize for. It's a strange thing, Ava, to become invisible on purpose. But once I did, your husband stopped watching what he said in front of me. He started talking like I was a piece of furniture. And furniture hears everything. We pulled into the storage facility a few minutes later, a long row of orange rolling doors under a gray Virginia sky, and Eleanor directed me to Unit 214 without needing to check the paper again. She'd clearly been here before, though she didn't say when, and I didn't ask. Some questions needed to wait their turn. The key turned easily. The door rolled up with a metallic groan that echoed down the empty row. Inside there was no furniture, no boxes of old clothes, none of the things you'd expect in a storage unit. Just a folding table, a single file box, and a small combination safe sitting beside it on the concrete floor. A plain white label was stuck to the top of the box, And on it, in Matthew's handwriting, I would have recognized anywhere after 8 years of grocery lists and birthday cards, were 2 words. Ava Sterling, my name. Filed away in a storage unit 20 minutes from my house like evidence in a case I didn't know was being built against me. I lifted the lid with hands that weren't entirely steady. The first document on top was a photocopy of a signature, my full name in the loops and slants I'd been writing since I was a teenager, sitting at the bottom of a page I had never seen before in my life. I stared at it for a long moment, waiting for some memory to surface, some context that would make this make sense. Nothing came. I never signed this, I said out loud to no one, to the empty storage unit, to my mother standing beside me on legs she'd hidden from the world for months. I've spent 12 years learning how to read documents that were designed to be misread: contracts, briefings, reports, written by people who wanted to bury the truth in language. Nothing prepared me for reading documents about my own life. The forged signature was just the first page. Underneath it sat a home equity line of credit application drawn against the house Matthew and I owned together, for an amount that made my stomach drop when I finally understood what I was looking at. I remembered signing paperwork related to a refinance. 18 months earlier, Matthew had handed me a stack of pages one evening, while I was grading a report for work. Told me it was routine, told me the loan officer needed signatures by Friday. I signed where he pointed. I never read past the highlighted lines. I trusted him the way I trusted the chain of command, because the system was supposed to have already checked it before it reached me. Beneath the loan documents were credit card statements, charges at a resort in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a boutique hotel, and Georgetown restaurants I'd never eaten at all, dated on nights. Matthew told me he was in Chicago and Dallas and Charlotte for client engagements. I did the math without wanting to. Some of these dinners had happened while I was on the phone with him, listening to him describe a hotel gym he swore he was standing in. Then came the lease agreement. A 1-bedroom luxury apartment in Arlington signed 8 months ago, tenant of record Matthew Sterling. I set it down on the folding table because my hands needed somewhere else to be. "There's more," Eleanor said quietly, and I understood from her tone that she'd already seen everything in this box, that she'd had time to sit with it before I ever would. The next folder held something worse than infidelity. A draft divorce filing, unfiled, unsigned, but complete. And attached to it a separate document that made my throat close up, a running log of dates and incidents written in Matthew's careful professional hand, cataloging what he called my behavioral patterns. Angry outbursts I didn't remember having. Drinking, that didn't happen. Emotional instability attributed to deployment stress, dated on days I could prove I was at Belvoir, sitting in briefings nowhere near home. He wasn't just planning to leave, he was building a case. A narrative designed to control the story before I ever knew there was a story to tell. The last folder held photographs. Matthew and a woman I didn't recognize, dark-haired, professionally dressed, laughing at something outside a restaurant I'd never been to. A name was written on the back of one photo in pencil. Vanessa Cole. "The affair isn't the worst part," Eleanor said, and I turned to look at her, genuinely unsure how anything could be worse than what I was already holding. She reached into her cardigan pocket and handed me a small USB drive. "I've been recording things since I started noticing. Conversations I was in the room for, things he said thinking I wasn't paying attention." She hesitated. "There's one you need to hear before you decide anything." I plugged the drive into my phone later that evening, sitting in Eleanor's room with the door closed, and listened to my husband's voice explaining me to another woman like I was a system he'd successfully mapped. "Ava trusts systems," he said, his voice light, almost amused. "That's her weakness. Put something official-looking in front of her and she assumes somebody already checked it." I sat with that sentence longer than I sat with the affair, longer than I sat with the fake apartment or the forged loan. Because he was right. He'd built his entire plan around the exact quality the Army had spent 12 years teaching me to trust in myself: discipline, respect for process, faith. That the paperwork in front of you had already been vetted by someone whose job it was to vet it. He hadn't found a weakness in me. He'd found the thing I was proudest of, and turned it into the hinge his whole plan swung on. My first instinct was rage, clean, simple physical rage. I wanted to drive home, change the locks, throw his belongings onto the front lawn before his flight even landed. Eleanor put her hand on my arm before I could reach for my keys. "Not yet," she said. "There's someone I want you to meet first." That afternoon we sat across a desk from Claire Donnelly, a family law attorney Eleanor had apparently been in contact with for weeks without my knowledge. Claire was direct in a way I respected immediately. No false comfort, no dramatics, just a clear-eyed assessment of what we had and what we needed. "Don't destroy anything of his," she said. "Don't access his accounts without authorization. Don't post anything. Don't confront the other woman. Don't use your military position to apply pressure of any kind. Everything we do from here needs to be clean documented and defensible. You collect and preserve what you already have lawful access to. That's it." Something in me settled when she said it. 12 years of following procedure, of trusting a system bigger than my own anger, clicked back into place. "Then we do this by the book," I said. Claire nodded, already flipping through the file box contents Eleanor had brought in a canvas bag. She paused on a bank statement, frowning slightly, then looked up at me. "When is Matthew coming home?" "Thursday," I said. "He told me Thursday." Claire shook her head slowly, sliding a printed page across the desk toward me. "An address. Nothing else. According to this, Matthew isn't in Chicago." She tapped the page once. "He's 20 minutes from here." I didn't drive to Arlington. That was the hardest decision I made all week, and it was Claire who talked me through it, sitting across her desk with her hands folded like she'd had this exact conversation with 100 other women who wanted to do exactly what I wanted to do. "If you show up there, you become the story," she said. "Right now, Matthew is the story. Don't hand him a version where you're the one who lost control." So instead of driving, I let Claire's investigator do what investigators are licensed to do. His name was Ron, a retired detective with a calm, unhurried way of talking, and within 2 days he confirmed what the lease agreement had already told us. Matthew was in Arlington. Vanessa was there too. But the affair, it turned out, was only the surface of what they were building together. Ron's report laid it out plainly. Matthew and Vanessa were in the early stages of launching their own risk consulting firm, and a portion of the money pulled from our home equity line had gone toward funding it office space, a website under development, a business account opened 4 months earlier under both their names. My husband hadn't just been unfaithful. He'd been quietly financing an entire second life using my signature and my house as collateral for a future that didn't include me. That evening my phone buzzed with a text from him. "Meetings are brutal. Miss you." I stared at those 4 words for a long time, sitting at my kitchen table with the file box from the storage unit still in the back seat of my car. Eleanor was in the next room, and I could hear the soft, uneven rhythm of her walking laps around the living room, building strength for legs that had waited 4 years to be used again. I typed back, "Miss you too. Good luck tomorrow." Sending it felt like swallowing glass. But it was also, I realized as I set the phone down, the exact moment the balance of power shifted. For 8 years, Matthew had known things about our marriage that I didn't. Now I knew things about him that he had no idea I possessed. He was still performing for an audience that no longer believed the show. Over the next 2 days, following Claire's instructions to the letter, I moved carefully. I changed the passwords on every account that belonged solely to me, accounts Matthew had access to only because I'd never had a reason to lock him out. I pulled my credit report and found 2 credit lines I hadn't opened, both tied to addresses I didn't recognize. I built a timeline on a legal pad, hour by hour, cross-referencing his claimed business trips against the credit card charges Eleanor had photographed months earlier. I separated my personal and military records into a locked drawer at my office, somewhere Matthew had never once set foot. And when Claire's team identified signatures that didn't match verified samples of my handwriting, she began the formal process of documenting forgery through the appropriate legal channels. It wasn't fast, it wasn't cinematic, it was methodical, and something in me, the part that had spent over a decade learning to trust, process over impulse, found a strange, steadying comfort in that. The deeper I went, the more I understood that Matthew's deception hadn't started 6 months ago. Some of the conferences stretched back nearly 3 years. Weekends I remembered as ordinary Matthew coming home tired, telling me about difficult clients, had actually been spent with Vanessa in places I was only now learning the names of. One night, sitting with my mother at the kitchen table, I finally asked her the question that had been sitting under my ribs since the storage unit. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? If you knew something was wrong, if you'd started to suspect him, why did you wait?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. "I need to tell you something about the day I fell," she said finally, and something in her voice made me go still. Matthew and I had argued that morning about a financial document he wanted me to sign, something related to a joint account he was setting up. I didn't like the way he was pushing me on it. My chest tightened. "Mom, did Matthew push you?" "No." She said it firmly without hesitation, and I believed her completely. "No, Ava." I slipped. I turned to walk away from him and I missed the step. "It was an accident. It was my own fault, my own bad footing." She paused. But after the fall, I didn't remember those last few minutes clearly. The head injury, the medication, it scrambled things. And Matthew used that. He started telling you I'd been confused lately, that I mixed things up, that my memory wasn't what it used to be. And you believed him, because why wouldn't you? He was the one taking care of me every day. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling 4 years of assumptions quietly rearrange themselves. I had spent so long crediting Matthew's devotion to my mother that I'd never once questioned why my own mother's doubts about her son-in-law had always seemed to evaporate before they reached me. "He didn't put me in that wheelchair, sweetheart," Eleanor said, reaching across the table for my hand. "But he learned how useful that wheelchair was to him. And once he understood that, he made sure I stayed exactly where he needed me to be." The next call came Wednesday night. Matthew's voice was bright, almost boyish, the way it always was when he thought he'd gotten away with something. "Good news, finished early, I'm coming home tomorrow morning." I looked down at the folders spread across my kitchen table, the lease, the statements, the fabricated incident log with my name at the top of every page. "I'll be here," I said, and my voice didn't shake at all. After I hung up, Claire, who'd stopped by that evening to review the final documentation with me, looked up from her laptop. "Are you ready?" I thought about the woman who'd trusted a stack of paperwork 18 months ago because she assumed someone had already checked it. That woman felt very far away now. For the first time in 8 years, I said, "He doesn't know more than I do." He walked through the door at 9:40 the next morning with his carry-on in one hand and a small gift bag from O'Hare in the other, some overpriced chocolate he probably grabbed in the last 10 minutes before boarding to sell the lie a little harder. I'd learned over the past week to notice these small performances for what they were. Before, I would have just called it thoughtful. "Hey." He kissed my cheek, dropped his bag by the stairs, the same stairs my mother had fallen down 4 years ago. "You would not believe the week I had." Eleanor was in the kitchen, back in her wheelchair, hands folded neatly in her lap. Matthew had no idea. That was the thing I kept returning to as I watched him move through our kitchen like nothing in the world had shifted. He had absolutely no idea that the woman he considered furniture had spent the last week walking laps around our living room, while he was in Arlington building a business with another woman. "How was the flight?" I asked, pouring him coffee like it was any other Thursday. He launched into it easily, a delay at O'Hare, a difficult client who kept pushing back on the risk model dinner with a CFO who apparently loved to talk about golf. Each detail arrived smooth and specific, exactly the kind of texture a man adds when he's had 4 years of practice making fiction sound like memory. I knew every word of it was false. I still nodded. I still asked a follow-up question about the client. Then I set my coffee down. "How's Vanessa?" It was small, half a second, maybe less. But I'd spent 12 years learning to read faces under pressure, learning to catch the flicker before someone composes themselves back into a lie, and I caught it. "Vanessa, who?" he said, too quickly, too flat. I didn't answer. I reached for the first folder on the counter. I'd set 3 of them out that morning, stacked neatly like a briefing packet, and slid it toward him. "The Arlington lease agreement." Matthew's eyes moved over it, and I watched him try 3 different expressions before settling on confusion. "What is this?" I slid the second folder across. "The financial statements. The resort charges. The hotel nights that lined up perfectly with nights he'd told me he was somewhere else entirely." His jaw tightened. "Ava, I can explain the accounts. It's not what it—" I set down the 3rd folder before he finished the sentence. "The draft divorce documents. The fabricated incident log with my name typed neatly at the top of every page." The room went very quiet. Matthew's face moved through the stages I imagine Claire had seen 100 times in other kitchens, other living rooms, across other counters, just like this one. First, denial, a flat reflexive, "This isn't what it looks like." Then, explanation rambling half-formed about business partnerships and stress and things getting complicated. Then, blame his voice rising, accusing me of going through his things, of overreacting, of not understanding context I supposedly lacked. And then finally the turn I'd been bracing for. "This is exactly what I've been worried about," he said, and his voice had shifted into something gentler, more concerned, more dangerous. "You're exhausted, you're paranoid, you're turning your mother against me." He looked past me toward the wheelchair. "Tell her," he said to Eleanor, "tell her this is crazy." My mother didn't say a word. "Eleanor," I watched her place both hands flat on the armrests of the chair she'd sat in for 4 years, the chair Matthew had wheeled her through countless doctor's appointments, the chair he'd used as proof over and over that she was harmless, that she was helpless, that she was exactly where he needed her. Slowly she pushed herself up. I don't think I will ever forget the sound Matthew made, not quite a gasp. Something smaller and more helpless than that, the sound of a man watching the foundation of his entire plan simply stand up and walk toward him. Eleanor took 2 unsteady steps, closing the distance between them, and looked him directly in the eye for what I think was the first time in months. "I've been listening to you for months, Matthew." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I could have let him keep talking, could have let him spiral through every excuse he had left, but I didn't want that fight. I didn't want the version of this where he screamed and I screamed back, and the neighbors called someone, and this became a story about 2 people losing control. "You set me up," he finally said, turning back to me, his voice cracking somewhere between fury and disbelief. "This whole morning you set me up." "No," I said. "We let you keep talking." He tried briefly to negotiate. He said something about working things out, about not throwing away 8 years over a mistake, his voice softening into the tone he used to use when he wanted something from me. I didn't argue with him. I told him calmly that everything from here forward would go through Claire, that I wasn't interested in relitigating any of it standing in our kitchen. "So that's it." He looked genuinely stunned. 8 years and you don't even fight for us." "I spent 8 years fighting for us," I said. "You spent the last few planning how to profit when I stopped." Something shifted in his face, then the last of the pleading version of Matthew burning off, leaving something colder underneath. He straightened his jacket, picked his bag back up off the floor like he'd decided in that instant to treat this like any other setback, any other risk to be managed. "You think those papers destroy me?" He almost smiled, and it was the smile that unsettled me more than anything else that morning, calm, certain like a man who still believed he was 3 moves ahead. "You haven't seen what I filed." He walked out the front door without looking back, and I stood in my kitchen next to my mother, who was still standing still upright, still holding her ground the way she had for the last several minutes of her life, that mattered more than the last 4 years combined. I didn't understand what he meant, not yet. But for the first time since I'd opened that storage unit door, I felt something cold settle low in my stomach, the unmistakable feeling of a soldier who has just realized the enemy still has 1 move left on the board. Claire called 2 days later, and I could tell from the first sentence that whatever Matthew had filed wasn't nothing. He'd retained his own attorney, a sharp litigator named Preston Ward, who specialized, according to Claire, in making messy divorces look like the other party's fault. Matthew's filing painted a portrait of our marriage that was in places almost unrecognizable to me. It claimed I was frequently absent due to military obligations, that I prioritized my career over our home life, that I had a pattern of emotional volatility he attributed, without ever using clinical language, to the stress of deployment, that I had left the bulk of Eleanor's caretaking to him for years, that I had signed financial documents without objection suggesting I either knew about or was willfully blind to decisions I now claimed ignorance of. What frightened me wasn't that it was all false, it was that pieces of it weren't. I had been away often, training rotations, temporary duty assignments, stretches of weeks where Matthew handled everything at home while I was 3 states away, learning things the Army needed me to know. I had signed documents without reading every line, trusting the man across the table from me the way I trusted a briefing officer who'd already done the vetting. I had let Matthew manage our finances almost entirely because it was easier, because he was good at it, because I had a full-time job that occasionally involved people shooting at me. Sitting in Claire's office with Matthew's filing spread across the table, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel: doubt, not about what he'd done, but about how it would look to a stranger reading only half the story. "This is how he wants to play it," Claire said, watching my face carefully. "He takes true things and builds a false structure around them. It's effective because juries and mediators respond to detail, not narrative. Our job is to give them more detail than his." So that's what we did, not with anger, with paperwork. I built a timeline with Claire's paralegal cross-referencing every deployment and training exercise against Matthew's claimed business trips, against bank withdrawals, against the Arlington lease. Every date I'd supposedly been emotionally unstable, according to his log. I had an official military record proving I was in a briefing room in the field, on a base 300 miles away, nowhere near the incidents he described. Every signature in question was sent to a forensic document examiner who confirmed within a week that at least 4 of them didn't match verified exemplars of my handwriting. It was slow, unglamorous work, the kind that doesn't make for good television, but wins the cases that actually matter. And piece by piece, Matthew's carefully constructed narrative began to come apart under its own weight. Vanessa was the first thread to unravel. Ron, the investigator, learned through public filings that she'd retained her own attorney the same week Matthew's petition went in, separate from him, not alongside him. It turned out Matthew had told her a very different financial picture than the one that actually existed, including how much of their business funding had actually come from money he no longer had lawful access to, once the forensic findings were shared with appropriate parties. When she understood the scope of what he'd built without telling her, she didn't defend him. She walked. Matthew's employer opened its own internal review not long after, once certain expense discrepancies were flagged through the proper channels, travel reimbursements for trips that, according to records, never happened the way he'd claimed. I want to be clear about something, because it matters to me even now. I never called his firm. I never leaked anything to a colleague, never sent an anonymous tip, never tried to reach into his professional life and pull it down around him. I didn't have to. Matthew had spent years building a structure out of lies stacked on top of each other, and structures like that don't need to be pushed. They just need enough weight added to the top before they find their own way down. The last real confrontation happened in a mediation room. Both attorneys present a long conference table between us. Matthew had lost most of the composure from that morning in my kitchen. His voice was tight, his jaw set, and at one point, when the attorneys stepped out to confer, he leaned across the table toward me. "You really want to burn down your whole life just to punish me?" he said, quiet enough that only I could hear it. I didn't flinch. "No, Matthew," I said. "I'm saving what's left of mine." By the end of that session, Matthew was facing exactly what the evidence said he should face: accountability for the funds he'd diverted, for the documents he'd forged, for the debt he'd built in my name without my knowledge. I didn't ask for everything. I didn't want revenge shaped like a scorched field. I asked for what was mine, what was my mother's, what was fair under the law, and nothing more. There's a particular kind of power in that restraint. One I didn't understand until I was standing inside it: the difference between destroying someone and simply refusing to let them take what was never theirs. Afterward, I walked out into the parking lot alone, the late afternoon light flat and gray across the asphalt. Eleanor was waiting by the car, leaning on a cane now instead of gripping a doorframe, her coat pulled tight against the wind. "Is it over?" she asked. I looked back at the building behind me, at the windows, where Matthew was probably still sitting with his attorney, still trying to find an angle I hadn't already closed off. "The marriage is," I said. Then I looked at my mother, really looked at her standing on her own 2 feet in a parking lot in November, 4 years and 1 lifetime away from the woman who'd needed me to push her wheelchair through that exact same lot. But I think we're just getting started. A few months pass, the way months do after something ends slowly at first, then all at once, until one day you look up and realize the ground under your feet has stopped shifting. The financial matters resolved the way they were supposed to, through the proper channels, through documents and hearings, and the kind of patient, unglamorous process that doesn't make for dramatic television, but delivers something better than drama. The truth entered into the record, impossible to argue with. Matthew was held accountable for what the evidence showed he'd done: the forged signatures, the diverted funds, the debt he'd built in my name without my knowledge. It wasn't vengeance. It was simply the truth catching up to him at the speed the law allows. The new life he and Vanessa had been building didn't survive the weight of what came out. I heard secondhand through people who still knew people that his position at the firm changed significantly once the internal review concluded. I want to be honest about something, though. I stopped tracking it after a while. Not because I forgave him, because I noticed one ordinary Tuesday that I'd gone an entire week without wondering what was happening in his life at all. That absence felt more like victory than anything a courtroom could have handed me. My mother kept going to physical therapy twice a week. One Saturday morning in early spring, I drove her to the park near her new apartment. She'd moved out of our house not long after everything settled into a small one-bedroom place with good light and no stairs to speak of, though she liked to joke that stairs didn't scare her the way they used to. I'd loaded the wheelchair into the trunk out of habit, the way you keep an umbrella in the car even when the sky looks clear. When we got to the park, I reached for it automatically. She stopped me with a hand on my arm. "I don't need it today." So we left it folded in the trunk, and my mother walked into the park on her own, one hand resting lightly on a cane, her steps slow and deliberate but entirely her own. I walked beside her close enough to catch her if she needed catching, but I didn't offer my arm. I'd learned somewhere in the last few months the difference between being present and being needed, and I understood now that my mother had spent 4 years being handled by people who mistook the first for the second. Watching her walk that morning unhurried past the fountain and the dog park, and the row of cherry trees just starting to bud, I understood something about the two of us that I hadn't let myself see clearly before. We'd both been sitting in some version of a wheelchair for years. Hers was made of a fall down a staircase, and a diagnosis nobody was brave enough to make certain. Mine was made of 8 years of trusting a man, because trusting him was easier than questioning him. Because I'd built my whole adult life around faith in systems that had already been checked by somebody else. Neither of us had chosen our chair, but we'd both eventually had to choose to stand up out of it. Matthew